We now move to our third speaker, Professor Leslie Chan, professor at the Department of Global Development Studies at the University of Toronto, Canada. He is one of the leading global advocates of open access and is on the advisory board of several international organizations, including the San Francisco Declaration on Research Assessment, the Directory of Open Access Journals, and the Steering Committee of Invest in Open Infrastructure. It's an absolute delight to listen to Professor Chan on the theme Opening Sciences from Below. Over to you, Professor.
Okay, so I'm going to share my screen right now. Is it working?
Yes,
you can see my slide?
Yes, we can see your slide.
Thank you so much. Thank you to the organizer for this panel. And of course, like Professor Balaram, when I heard that this panel is also in honor of my very dear friend, Professor Arunachalam, I would not hesitate. And you will see in my talk, I will interweave a lot of lessons that I have learned from Arun. I would say I owe a lot to what in terms of my own thinking and practices. I owe a lot to Arun, exposure to his way of thinking, but also I have to emphasize Arun is to me the quintessential human network. He knows everybody, he knows every institution, and he connects people, and it is that connectivity, that human connectivities, that I want to also pay tribute to today. So the title of my talk is called Opening Science from Below. I won't define it. Hopefully, as I go through my presentation, you will begin to understand what I'm trying to get across in terms of ideas of opening science from below. So there are three key points I like to make. So Professor Balaram has very eloquently highlighted the nature of today's commercialization of publications and the pressure of the global on the local and the kind of pressure to publish and the kind of negative consequences that are resulting from the corruption of science from commercialization. I would say that a lot of this also have very direct impact on local research, local scientists, community researchers, and their knowledge system. And so I think the more I've been thinking about this topic of open science, open access in the last 20 years, the more I think it is important that we strengthen the local and not simply looking at what is important at the global or international level. So that's key point number one. And second point is that social infrastructure is the key. As I said, it is people like Arun, people like you who organize this conference, and many of you who work in the libraries, in the fields on research. You rely on each other in terms of support and all kinds of ability to make and share knowledge. So it is not just the technology that is important. We have a tendency to focus on the technology infrastructure, that we need the next latest shiny new tools, and we forgot it is ultimately human that makes this work. And again, having visited some of the institute in India, particularly the first time I visited India Institute of Science and Indian Academy of Science, where they published many of their own journals, and looking at all the people that are involved in making these happen, you realize how important it is the people that make these happen. So we need to think about how we continue to support people as a key in terms of knowledge production and dissemination. And as we think about people, it reminds us of the third pillar, the third point that I like to emphasize is that science policies must take into account those who have been marginalized, both intellectually or epistemologically, and they have been made invisible because of the kind of market structures that Professor Balaram talked about. And so we need to think about these policy implications and think about people from below, so to speak. Arun and I, as I said, have a long friendship, and of course Arun has organized many events, been very active over the years in promoting open access in India and elsewhere. Someone is, excuse me, could someone mute their microphone, please? Yeah. One of the first workshop that I took part in that Arun invited me to back in 2002 at the Indian Academy of Science, and of course the website is no longer there. This is over almost 20 years ago, this event. But funny enough, I printed out the web pages. So the other day I was just cleaning my file, happened to run across this printout. And the reason I want to show is because this picture is important. This is Arun right here, up there, and Prakash, who works at Indian Academy Science, and this is our very dear friend Barbara Kursoff, who's one of the co-founder of Byline International, one of the earliest open access platform. And in the back here is a young doctor by the name of D.K. Sahu. I will come back to the story of D.K. Sahu.
Sorry, we don't see the picture. At least I don't see the picture.
You don't see any picture?
Yeah, I see your face.
You see my face?
No, Professor
we can see the picture, sir. We can see the picture.
See. It's fine. Maybe.
I'm sorry. Yeah. Okay.
Okay. So are you still okay with the picture?
Yes. Just make it full screen, please.
Yeah, please go ahead. Please go ahead.
It's back to full screen?
Yeah, exactly.
Okay. Thank you. Okay. Thank you. Fast forward a couple of years, and you see another picture, another events that Arun put together, this time at the Indian Institute of Science, and you will see a young, handsome Professor Balaram standing over in the far corner here. And this time, D.K. Sahu, the young doctor, is served as one of the resource person for this workshop, bringing together quite a number of scholarly society and journal publishers from different organizations across India. And I got to meet many of these colleagues who still work, we're still in connection on a regular basis. And again, just for historical interest, I had the opportunity, the pleasure of doing an interview with Professor Balaram. At the time, he was the director of the Indian Institute of Science, and he was talking about the importance of institutional repository. So again, for historical interest, you might want to go take a look. And of course, I did an interview of Arun himself. At the time, I was calling him Mr. Open Access in India, and he talked about the advocacy he had been doing and some of the wishes he have about policies in India. And again, for historical interest, you could take a look. So I'm coming back to this young fellow, D.K. Sahu, on the left-hand side here. So in 2002, when I met D.K. Sahu, he was one of the workshop participants. By 2004, he's actually started his own online open access journal, started with a couple of them, with the Journal of Postgraduate Medicine. And by 2004, he was getting very anxious and ambitious about open access publishing. And 2 more years later, he established open access book publishing company called Matno Publications. And so he worked primarily with scholarly society across India. Many of them publish their own journals, but don't have the infrastructure to publish on a sustainable basis. So Sahu created this platform infrastructure. He hired many programmers, invested in all of his own resources. He gave up his practice as a doctor to start this endeavor. And from a few journals with scholarly society, it grew to almost a couple of hundred journals in a few years. He used what's called a freemium model, where people can access the basic HTML content for free, but if you want the PDF version, you have to pay a small fee. He was also able to charge advertisers for the print versions of many of the journals. And so through a few years' time with different business income and so forth, he was able to provide open access to a large number of scholarly society publishers across India. And he also began to work with publishers, small independent journal outside of India. So that was a success story, but then come the crunch. Wolters Kluwer, which is a big German publisher, saw the dollar signs that Matt Knowles can bring with all the content, particularly with health content. Many of them focused on the subcontinent and South Asia. Wolters Kluwer saw this as a golden opportunity for them, and they acquired Matt Knowles under terms that cannot be disclosed. But not only did Wolters Kluwer acquire Matt Knowles, they took over the entire infrastructure itself. So all the programming and all the underlying peer review infrastructures and publishing infrastructure, XML markup and all that thing, those technical know-how were all taken by the takeover. Now, if you go to the website today, you'll notice that Matt Knowles now have 480 journals, and so they obviously, Wolters Kluwer has grown this business. And on the tagline on the top there, you see it says this is a leading global publishing service providing peer-reviewed scholarly open access journals. And so this is another example that speaks to Professor Balaram's identification of these commercial publishers that are really taking advantage of open access, but not simply of open access, but of local know-how and local infrastructure. And we don't tend to think about that. We tend to think, oh, well, India, what does India have to offer? Or for that matter, what other global South country has to offer in terms of publishing? But this kind of takeover, it goes on a regular basis, historically and in the current time. And whenever a Western powerful entity comes in and take it from any global South endeavor, they don't give them the credit. They just take over and take over everything, lock, stock, and barrel. This to me is a form of it's similar to me as a new form of settler colonialism, only in the digital space, and at the same time it make invisible a lot of the local initiative and local effort that has been built up over time and simply diminished by these kind of international takeover. And again, the infrastructure to me is always a key, but is often not talked about. So again, let's wind back the clock a little bit. Again, the first time I met Arun, actually, what was so profoundly important for me was that Arun at the time in the early 2000s was still a fellow at the MS Swaminathan Research Foundation, and Professor Swaminathan is widely credited as the founder of the Green Revolution in India, has revolutionized a lot of research on agriculture, but he also set up this very important research foundation with a key mission of knowledge sharing with the poorest of the poor. And Professor Swaminathan famously always says, if agriculture fails, everything else will fail. And India builds on agriculture. And so it is important that the farmers themselves be seen as the knowledge holders and the knowledge producers. If the farmers are decimated, we will all be decimated because their knowledge is the key to our survival. So a lot of the program that was set up at the Swaminathan Research Foundation, using the technology of the time 20 years ago, was to use basic technologies to make sure that information are shared between different stakeholders And again, the key stakeholders to Professor Swaminathan's are the farmers and the women who also work in a large percentage in the rural area. They hold the key to knowledge exchange. And open up one of those brochure, which I kept from a long time ago. I'm reminded of how much of these principles that we're talking about, so Heather just referred to, about equity and inclusion. And these are all built into their program from the ground up. And I particularly am reminded about the importance of the right-hand bottom here is about the right-hand top there about social inclusion. And of course, it harked back to Mahatma Gandhi's pathway, where empowerment starts with the poorest and the most underprivileged, women and men, and those who are often disregarded by society as not even worthy of being considered as part of society. And so a lot of these programs, these rural knowledge program and the village center program and human center program talks about communication, not only between scientists from lab to lab, but between scientists and farmers working on the ground, but also from farmers working on the ground back to the scientists. And of course, most importantly, between the farmers themselves. And so these type of network of exchanges center all these type of players, not just the scientists themselves. And I think over time in the West, there's a tendency to center the scientists as the end all and be all, and their publications and their output becomes the measure of scientific progress, to the detriment of a lot of the local knowledge that are being forgotten or even systematically erased, one form or another. One example being this digital colonialism that I've referred to. But their indigenous knowledge, local knowledge are constantly systematically erased everywhere in the world. And to me, that's one of the biggest threat to science, to the future of well-being, especially of the system of this existential crisis we're facing with climate change today. Again, back to Arun. The last trip I made with Arun was in 2012, and we roamed through literally quite a number of cities in Kerala. And in Kerala, many of you know about their healthcare system and many of the social system that are quite different from other parts of India. And I get to meet some of the very interesting projects, labor movement, local open source software, independent startups and so forth, a vibrancy of very, very many different local communities generating knowledge, making knowledge and sharing knowledge. And these kind of understanding have shaped my own research. And over the last few years, my research has been very much focused on science with the people and for the people. And that open access has to think beyond just the scientific community and the academic community, but to include knowledge holders, makers from across the spectrum of society. And so openness is really about opening up knowledge of everybody, because we really we're all better off with a much more diversity of knowledge. And of course, particularly we need to focus on knowledge that has been historically excluded and marginalized. And again, the stigma about knowledge from the South or from the margins that are not worthy of scientific attention, we need to change that mindset. And I have the privilege of working with a number of colleagues, Professor Budhall, Florence Piron, who unfortunately passed away recently, Professor Rajesh Tandon, who is a founder of Participatory Research India based in Delhi, and have learned, and of course, Professor Lorna Williams, an indigenous scholar from the west coast of Canada. And these scholars have taught me a great deal about working with community and centering community knowledge. And the Rajesh groups in Delhi, the Priya, has been doing this kind of work for over 40 years. And so again, looking to the local for what we have been neglecting, to me, is a key theme. I'm showing this picture because I remember one time we were walking in one of the market in Kerala, and I was just fascinated with all the different bananas and the fruits that was in the market. And of course, there are hundreds of varieties of bananas from across the continent and around the world. But of course, we don't see the diversity of these kind of food crops anymore. In our supermarket, we see those very homogenized form of bananas because they can be packaged into a box and be shipped easily, could be part of the supply chain. So in order to be mass produced on a global scale, the variety of banana has to be decimated in order to find a variety that could grow into these boxes. And I see scholarly publications as being under the same kind of production regimes. We are being asked to put our stuff into boxes that we're called journal, and they have to fit a certain standards set up by the publishers, or in this case of food producers. To me, they are very similar in terms of how they operate. And what we've seen over time globally is that a smaller number of producers are dominating more and more of the market. And one of the consequences when we look at food production is that, of course, a handful of varieties of wheat and grains are now 5 different grains, rice, wheat, and so forth, and maize dominate 90% of the global food market today. And I see the same trend happening with scholarly production, that a small number of companies are producing highly homogenized scholarly output as part of their supply chains to maximize their profit along the supply chain. Now, this is actually a rejoinder to what Professor Balaram referred to earlier about the kind of shameful practices of maximizing profit. So what you have here is a graph showing some of the most brand name well-known journals, Nature, Cell, Science, Lancet, and so forth, how they have been spinning out what they call mirror journals or sister journals or offspring journals to capture the brand name. So you have Nature Reviews, you have Nature Genetics, you have Nature this and Nature that, and over the last 20 years, they have created over 30 of them, these different branded journals. And they, of course, because of their brand, because of their supposedly higher prestige and impact factor, the well-to-do researchers and institutions flock to these branded journals to increase their own visibility. Now, what's interesting is that last year, at the height of the pandemic, of course, in the US, there were a lot of soul searching, given the kind of racist uprising that were happening in the country, and particularly after the murder of George Floyd by a policeman in the US. And so across society and including academia, there were a lot of tough questions being asked about how we are complicit in a system that is systemically racist, and how systemic racism manifests differently in different institutions and different practices. What was interesting was that Nature put out this editorial admitting that Nature as an organization is one of the white institutions that is responsible for bias in research and scholarship, and that the enterprise of science have been and remains complicit in systemic racism, and it must strive harder to correct those injustices and amplify marginalized voices. Okay, good for science in making this statement, but in effect, what have they done? And they haven't done really much, as you see. I was also very interested in the history of this journal, this very well-known institution. Nature goes back to 1869. And in this book, it's documented the history of this journal. What was interesting, one fact is that over this long history of this journal since 1869, there was only 7 male editors-in-chief. They all serve long tenure. It's only in the last 3 years or so where we see a co-editor-in-chief who is a woman. One particular passage stood out to me in the book. There are lots of them, but this one from one of the editor-in-chief, John Maddox, that reacted to a news story about Nature's coverage of certain controversial topic. And Maddox says that there is a powerful school of thought that think that really represented by other editors of journals, which holds that scientific literature is and should be a passive means of communication, a mirror held up to the face of research in which people other than its authors can discover what is happening in laboratories the world over. This, he said, however, is an idealization which is far from the truth. In other words, it is a myth that journals are simply passive recorders of scientific record, that they only report what's been published or being conducted by others. What Maddox is saying is that journals, powerful institutions like Nature, actually shape what constitutes science. And if you read the book, you'll get lots of different take on this. Journals like Nature and most of the Western journals shape the nature of science and discourse, what is constitute legitimate knowledge in those fields, and editors serves as the gatekeeper to enforce those boundaries. And so these boundaries, of course, are very hard to cross. You have to be socialized into these institutions. You become one of them in order to get published and be successful. So it's not simply just the money you have to pay, but you have to be willing to fit into the system that is being defined by these very powerful entities. Now, Nature is not only powerful in defining what science and what legitimate knowledge is, as we've been looking at how they've been very also greedy, to put it very mildly, in spinning out journals, and they even have this pyramid scheme of charging authors. So the top one, the Nature, of course, is at the top of the food chain, charges the most and have the highest rejection rate. And if you go down this pyramid, the scientific report has a lowest rejection rate, and therefore it will charge you also the less. So they're actually pegging their cost to the prestige of these journals, which then would rise and fall with the journal impact factor. And so your fortune will depend on the marketplace, so to speak. And of course, as Heather and as Professor Balaram pointed out, these are really systemic corrupting influence, but this systemic problem goes way back. This is not new. This kind of discriminatory structure is 2.5 centuries in the making. This kind of hierarchicalization of who get published, whose knowledge counts, and so forth is systemic in this sense. And racism doesn't have to be about just very overt act of discrimination. Racism is very much about institutional practice that privilege certain way of knowing over others, right? And Vandana Shiva, of course, many of you in India knows her, talks about this notion of the monoculture of the mind. And the monoculture of the mind is really what a lot of journals perpetuate. And this monoculture of the mind treats diversity as disease and creates coercive structures to remodel this biologically and culturally diverse world of ours on the concepts of one privileged class, one race, and one gender of a single species. So there are these standards that are then encoded into the journals. And in order for you to publish in these journals, you need to socialize yourself into this singular standards that are often invisible. Recently, we have the good fortune of putting together a podcast series, actually in partnership with Spark, the organizations that Heather oversees. And we invited a number of indigenous knowledge holders and scholars from different parts of the world to share the thought about their epistemologies and how they see their world in relations to Western science. Well, there's lots of different ideas, of course, but one of the things that constantly came up was the relationship of ourselves with the land. That is, in Western science, we treat the land as something we dominate over, something we study, something we then alter so we can shape. Whereas all these indigenous knowledge holders reminded us land is what we are dependent on. Without land, we're nothing. And so it is not we that should be shaping the land. We should be listening to the land, to learn from the land in order to really exist well, live well into the future. But of course, well, we have done the exact opposite. Right? I want to take a particular quote from Professor Meyer, who's an indigenous scholar from Hawaii. And when she said that when you gather people like us together, meaning the indigenous scholars, we recognize difference and we honor difference, because difference is what we have in common. But when we go deep into difference, I have found the depth of what it means to be universal. I believe Western systems confuse universality with uniformity. And this is why our specific epistemology found in our own Hawaiian culture is now called holographic epistemology. It must include everyone, and everyone's thinking is old when you prioritize it with a value system that prioritizes love of land and service to people. And so I've come back to the conclusion and why I named the talk Opening Science from Below, and that is we need to begin with the land. And land is not, I'm not saying land is from below, it's just below referring to the communities, the people who live on the land itself. That's the grassroots. That's where we need to begin when we think about science, when we think about policies. And if we ignore the majority of the people who are marginalized, who are underrepresented, the whole structures would not be sustainable. And that, again, peoples are the key of our investment, and we don't think enough about investing in people. So I end here, and again, thank you, Arun, for your friendship, for your teaching, and for your constant, tireless advocacy despite all the barriers. So again, thank you very much, Arun, and everybody who organized this conference. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that very insightful, talk on you perfectly blended the issues that the systemic issues that are plaguing the open science movement, and also spoke about several important issues, including racism and science colonization as well. Thank you so much, Professor Chang.